So, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I think it's a great honor for me to be here and speak with so many distinguished people studying the history of the book and especially its future. You may remember when the iPad was first launched that many people were speculating on what the iPad was actually meant to do. And this was very much a question. It seemed like one of these gadgets that only Steve Jobs could invent, but what it was actually going to be for, nobody really knew. This is the oldest iPad, the version 1. That's the one I bought immediately because I was also very curious to find out what it could do and what I could use it for. Now, I still have it and I still use it, but not as much as my laptop, I must confess. You may be familiar with this particular quote about Steve Jobs when he was asked what market research he had carried out in order to launch the iPad. He said, none. It's not the job of the consumer to know what they want. He knew what people wanted. Well, if that was only true of the book. The book is not having an easy time. This is a few figures from a Slovenian survey carried out earlier this year in June, and the results are yet to be published, but the author shared these figures with me. And as you can see, the number of avid readers is coming down. The figures speak for themselves. I don't have to explain to you. This means that the book is no longer held in the same sort of esteem that it always used to be. And this is confirmed also by these figures. The attitude to books is clearly changing. A massive 29% of respondents in 2014 said, well, the book doesn't really matter to me. They're not interesting. Compared to 1998, 2%, a massive increase indeed. And of course, not every country is finding the effects of this, but certainly the Netherlands is. And these are the figures of the Dutch book sales over the last decade or so. And as you can see, they're going down. And 2014 is currently running at more than 10% down on the previous year. So it is a continuing trend downwards. Yet, as we all know, it is vital for anyone in modern society to read. You cannot really be a member of a Western society without being able to read. So this is normal. People used to read books, but of course now everybody is also reading on their mobile phones. And I think, although it's very difficult to come up with real figures because the definition of reading has shifted over the last few years, I think you can safely say that more people are doing more reading today than they've ever done in history. That is, of course, if you count non-books, non-newspapers, non-magazines, but any screen that has text on it. The statistics are therefore difficult to compare because until recently, reading was only compartmentalized as real reading, books and newspapers and magazines, but not all that other reading. And I think every one of us knows how much time that other reading takes in a day. So, at the same time, we're seeing that reading is going down and reading is going up. Now, that seems a bit like a paradox, but of course we all know how to resolve that paradox. Very simple. People read differently, and they read differently in terms of price, new text forms, and different distribution channels. Price, obviously, most people spend a lot of time reading something outside of the commercial channels, outside of books, newspapers, and magazines. Free content, news online, fan fiction, long reads, classics, public domain texts, and of course illegal ebooks, and new forms like texting, blogs and social media, email, didn't exist before, but they mean an awful lot of what we call in the reading research trade, reading kilometers. You know, just the number of words you read in a day. And of course, the most important perhaps is the different distribution channels. They're outside of the trade. Marginal channels. Well, marginal between inverted commas, because we started by calling Amazon marginal. Now, of course, it is very much central to the book trade. E-book ventures, I don't know, I know of one or two ones in Spain, but in Holland only this year, 2 new ventures started up, one selling second-hand e-books and one doing streaming. Streaming already existed, so it's just a new venture, but you know, they spring up every few months, new ventures to do with reading in new ways, so through different distribution channels. Now, I am actually originally, not quite originally, but I am a book historian. And as a book historian, I was reminded by this, what we've just seen, I was reminded of the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was a similar situation in the sense that more people than ever started reading. There was an enormous number of new readers because education was made compulsory for the first time in many European countries. So for the first time, classes of readers who would not have gone to school now had to go to school. They learned reading and they were clamoring for reading material. They all wanted stuff to read. Yet, interestingly, at that time, there was talk in the book trade of crisis. And this is actually a publication that came out in the Netherlands in the middle of the 19th century, 1845, and the question was, is the book trade declining? Now, as we now know, with the benefit of hindsight, this was at the moment when the largest expansion of readers was happening, and the largest increase in production of book titles was just about to happen, and yet the trade thought that it was going down the drain. It was about to disappear. And so this essay won the prize because it was optimistic. It thought, this essay won among the whole book trade optimistic thoughts about the future of the book. Yes, we would be okay as a book trade, things would work out. So what was the problem? That at the same time, there was this huge increase in title production just about to happen, and the book trade thought it was going to disappear. Well, it was a long process of trying to discover this new audience, which was just springing up. It was just happening. So the first attempt was this sort of thing. It was publishing the same stuff that publishers had always been publishing, but cheaper. Because the new readers came from the bottom of the market. They were people who hadn't read before. They were aspiring to knowledge. So, if we just presented them with knowledge, but cheaply, then the book trade would be rescued. So here you've got an example of how a bookseller and publisher tried to make it clear that all this new stuff could be read in any sort of location, by anyone, under any conditions, but it was all the old stuff repackaged in new, cheaper ways. But this was what the audience was really waiting for. As you can see, there's also Spanish there, raffles, and all the other types of literature that I'm showing you here was the real answer that people were looking for. That is to say, not the same stuff but cheaper, but different reading matter. Completely different reading matter. Now, this happens all over Europe. I've got an example there from America, an example from Britain, I've got an example from the Netherlands, 2 examples from Spain, but I could show you examples from Italy, from Germany, from everywhere. And this stuff was not distributed through the same channels. This was distributed through, for example, kiosks, as you still have them here today. We don't in the Netherlands so much, but this was a photograph from Paris, and Paris, as you all know, still has these kiosks. Different channels of distribution, different reading matter at lower prices. Now, where it gets really interesting, I think, is in trying to compare these two situations, the 19th century, the 21st century, and to understand why and how these things happened and why it took so long for the 19th century book trade to understand what was happening. So we've seen that I mentioned price, type of content, distribution of content. So the first line is there. These are similar things in both eras. Now the channels, you might say that something like Amazon is not all that different from a company which is called Eichler. And I don't know if you've heard of Eichler, but Eichler is a 19th century publisher that had offices all over Europe, and they were publishing that really cheap, what we now call pulp literature, translated in various languages, multinational, like Amazon, and catering to new readers in different ways from the traditional way in which people bought reading matter. So I showed you the kiosks, but you can also think of tobacconists, for example, railway bookstalls and that sort of places, all new. The difficulty people had was identifying this new audience because there was a mismatch between two sets of mentalities. The mentality of the book trade, which knew what it was doing, and the new readers who weren't looking for what the book trade was doing. Now, what alerted me to the importance of mentality was an experience that I had last year in Paris with my wife. We went, as we like to do, to a good restaurant for lunch. Now, it's not the restaurant I'm going to show you. It's not this one. But something similar. We wanted to have a good experience, good food, as you know, the French are very proud of. This is a very sort of, well, hierarchical institution, a sort of top-down experience. I indicated by means of a sort of vertical arrow. And while we were sitting there having our lunch, and it got towards 3 o'clock, and we were just talking over lunch about the fact that here you find 3 o'clock perfectly acceptable to have lunch, but in France, 3 o'clock is really the end of lunchtime in one of those traditional places. So the waiter was looking at people who wanted to join the restaurant to have lunch, looking at them sort of scowling, like, what are you trying to get into? This is a real restaurant. And he was really being nasty. He sent people away, like, you know, go away, go somewhere else, go round the corner, because round the corner you've got hamburgers. That, of course, is a very democratic sort of institution. And it made me think, you know, why is this man being so disdainful? I mean, after all, if he just tells them tomorrow there's another time to have lunch, or tonight you can have dinner with us, but he actually just sent them away in a rather nasty way. And I thought, well, this is simply because of a difference in mentality. The restaurant owner obviously was in that traditional mold, and he thought, you know, this is an establishment that offers proper lunch. And you can't have proper lunch outside proper lunch hours. So if you want something to eat outside of lunch hours, you cannot be looking for proper food. So he sent them to McDonald's around the corner. Lunch hour has to be respected. So this difference of mentality, the clash between the visitor, who wasn't looking for cheap food, who was looking for good food, and the restaurant mentality, like we're here for good food and you cannot have good food outside of ours, was to me an eye-opener. I thought, you know, this is what's going on also to some extent in the book trade. Now, of course, I'm making much of the similarities between the 19th century and 21st century, but there are also differences. So let's look at some of the differences. In the 19th century, these developments were as much social developments as they were technological, perhaps even more social than technological. Whereas in the 20th century, they're more technological and less social. Now, I'll explain that. I've already said that in the 19th century, these new readers come from the bottom of the market up as a result of the fact that they go to school for the first time and start to read. So the role of education is very important. We're talking about a very hierarchical society. These new readers wanted to aspire upwards on the social mobility ladder. In the 20th century, that is no longer the case. There is no longer that hierarchical relationship, which I just indicated by means of the vertical arrow in Parisian restaurants, but it's a much more democratic society. So what we get is, we do get readers coming up from the bottom, but they don't necessarily aspire to achieving the same sort of social status as their superiors. But what we do see, and that's perhaps similar to the 19th century, is that people who are used to doing reading in a particular way are now also falling to the lure of more democratized ways of distribution of reading matter. But in the 21st century, I think the driving force is technology, and I don't think there's two ways about it. In the 19th century a little bit, because rotary presses, as opposed to the old hand press, but rotary presses churned out many more copies per hour than flatbed presses. So once a printer had invested in one of these rotary presses, he was looking automatically for larger print runs in order to be able to use the capacity of his new machine. So they were looking towards reading, towards publishing reading matter for as wide an audience as possible. So in a sense, you could say they were marketing their literature for the first time much more than previously. They had to, because otherwise they couldn't pay for the machines that they had invested in, because these rotary machines were expensive. So the 21st century, I think, is technology-driven. I mean, the changes are technology-driven. And so how do I see this mentality mismatch that we saw in the Parisian restaurants, that we saw in the 19th century Dutch book trade? How do I see that in the 21st century? Who are the so-called new readers? And as I said, they come both from the bottom, new readers who haven't read before but who are now joining things like social media, Facebook. They start Facebook accounts, so they start to do more reading than they've ever done. And they, I would say, are more open to the whole idea that reading is something you do. But also, of course, people who've always been readers who are now affected by a different way of reading presented by digital screens. Okay, I would suggest to you that there is such a thing as an online generation. It's not easy to say who these people are, because they come from all walks of life and they are traditional readers just as much as new readers, but I would say that there is a mentality growing that you could call an online mentality. So we've got an online generation, and as I said, it's additional to existing readers. It's not like the one replaces the other. And they are online 24/7 for communication, for media consumption, and for products and services. They are used to instantaneous results for whatever action they carry out online. And they're used to democratic two-way traffic, Web 2.0. It's not one way, it's not vertical, it is horizontal. You can just as much reflect and reply to people as people can push. So it's two-way traffic. In that two-way traffic, the producer and the consumer are equal on the same democratic level. So how does this lead to a different mentality with different expectations? The online mentality, I think, comes with the idea that we want instant gratification, that content is free, or at least virtually free, cheap, And that access to content is something that we filter. We are the people who are in control of what reaches us. So we set preferences, so we create profiles, so we listen to our peers for advice, but we are in charge. It's not the publisher who tells us what to read, it's us. Very importantly, I think, we're seeing a movement that access is more important than ownership of reading materials and also of other media products. And even perhaps more than just media products, I'll come back to that. And this, you might say, sums it up. If something doesn't reach me, it's probably not relevant. And of course, what can be done online must be done online. Now, what I'd like to do is try and relate this to digital technology, and especially to its most prominent and intrusive form, the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web is based, as you know, on computers. So computers are universal machines, that is to say they are programmable to do anything you want as long as you can catch it in an algorithm. So computers are infinitely adjustable to any task you like to set it as long as you can program it. And it is, and the second thing, it's a digital electronic device, meaning the whole thing takes place digitally with the use of electronics. Now, based on these two primary or core properties of the computer, I have made a list of the differences between paper and the digital screen. And I think you'll recognize all of these. I don't need to explain any of them, I don't think, but you've got the fixity, stability of and permanence of paper versus the fluidity, instability and impermanence of the digital. You've got the offline versus the online, meaning that in online you can do things like hyperlinking. You've got the difference between materiality and tangibility, and the immateriality and intangibility of the screen, or of the screen text, not of the screen itself. This might need a little bit of explanation. It's shorthand for, if you have a book, then the book is identical with the text that contains it. And the book can only contain the text that contains it, but not any other. But when you have a digital device, obviously it can contain any text at all. So your device is no clue to what texts it contains or may contain at any time. On paper, we're talking about products with the attendant economic scarcity, and on screen we're talking about services which are inexhaustible. I've always maintained that any file comes with a built-in printing press. You can print as many copies digitally as you like, and never will the file be exhausted. Paper is one way, digital screen is two-way. We saw that before. Paper is duomodal, meaning it's only got text and the pictures don't move in books. And screens are multimodal. You've got not just the text and still pictures, you've also got moving pictures, you've got sound, you've got music, you can have games if you like. Digital screens deal with machine-readable text, which is searchable, which I think is one of the primary differences. And in the case of paper, you've got a certain technological and economic limitation regarding length of the book. You don't get books on the whole that are outside the range of, say, 50 to 1,500 pages. A longer book is difficult to make. A shorter book, according to the UNESCO definition, it has to be 48 plus pages, otherwise it is not a book. But that's for historical reasons. It's not arbitrary. It is because of the printing press. So let me just give you a few examples of how I see that these properties lead to particular, or at least have connections with particular examples of mentality shifts. So mentality shift one, news needs to be free. And you all know that as a phenomenon, that people find it enough to read news that's free online rather than having a subscription to a newspaper. And this is one of the major reasons, of course, why newspapers are dying everywhere across the globe. Every newspaper is suffering from diminishing print runs. And this, of course, is enabled, at least, and perhaps to some extent caused, by the fact that there is two-way networking going on the internet. So, second example, digital text has less value. You may recognize this as a notion that's very current, and there's interesting research to back this up. I'll give you a few examples. These are three articles that explain why this could be happening. The first one is Ackerman and Goldsmith's Metacognitive Regulation of Text Learning, which shows you that research has found that people reading digital text approach digital text with less seriousness than they approach paper. So they don't even begin to have the same structural attempt at making sure they understand what the text says. You know, if you really want to learn what a text says, you check yourself. You go back to a passage and you wonder, did I really understand this chapter? Did I understand what this paragraph was saying? But in digital text, you just scan and don't take the text very seriously. And the third article is very, very well known, I think. That's that F-shaped pattern when you reach web texts. Web texts are scanned like an F-shaped pattern. You begin seriously and read the whole length, and then you just scan lines down, and you don't come even to the end of the line. Just showing how people don't take that sort of screen reading as seriously as pages, paper pages. Then there's price perception. There is a lesser preparedness to pay for texts, probably, than for games, films, and music. That hasn't really been researched to a large extent, but I would submit to you that this is probably what turns out to be the case if you do research it. And I'm always a little bit worried about what the effect that open access might have in this regard, because much as I applaud the idea that scholarly information should be made freely available to everyone in the form of open access, at the same time, again, the erosion of any notion that texts cost money will be helped by the fact that scholarly texts are made available free of charge on the internet. And I would suggest that all of this can be related to two things in our scheme of salient technological properties, namely non-materiality and fluidity of text. The third example is that access is more important than ownership, which I've already suggested. If you look at it, I don't know what it's like here in Barcelona, but in Amsterdam, for example, there's a whole movement which is almost ideologically driven, where people say they are not interested in owning things anymore. They don't own cars, they don't own tools, and they don't own even jeans. And they go and borrow them online, because that's possible now. And they pay a small fee for having the loan of a pair of jeans to go out with, so they don't have to wear the same pair of jeans 2 nights in a row. Anyway, the web is an access technology, as we saw. It offers services rather than products. So a subscription model for ebooks is being widely adopted all around the world now. And of course, this is similar to what happened with music, iTunes and other music services like that. But compare also this phenomenon to what has been in existence for longer, mass media. You don't own the texts from newspapers. Well, you do, but that's not why you get a newspaper subscription. You get a newspaper subscription because you are interested in the service that the newspaper offers you, and the next day your newspaper is used to wrap fish in. But think of radio, think of television. You don't own the content. You own the machine, the device, the apparatus. And that's, of course, what happened with digital music as well. You owned the MP3 player, but the music you just rented from iTunes. And this is what's happening also with ebooks now, with Amazon. You rent the ebooks, you don't ever own them. You can't own them, you only get a license to read for as long as the license is not revoked. And we all know what happened with 1984, which Amazon found it didn't have the rights for. And so it just wiped all copies of 1984 of any e-readers that had it. So this, I would suggest, is enabled by non-materiality and the service nature of digital text. So we're talking about... oh, what's happening here? Sorry about that. So we're talking here about a socio-technical development, I would suggest, that we have seen certain technological properties and affordances that the properties have. That's level one. Then we get certain actions or uses that follow from that. And following on from those, follow certain social effects. Now, we've got to realize that we're not always talking about intended effects. In fact, mostly, I'd say, we're talking about unintended effects, side effects that nobody had foreseen when we invented these technologies. Technology does not have an agency. I'm not saying that technology does these things, but it has inherent characteristics that make it more suitable to do one thing than to do another. So these are misleading titles. What technology wants. Technology doesn't want anything. Technology enables certain things. And those things are more likely to happen than the things that technology has to be made to do. And so going back to book history, this was the printing press as an agent of change. Well, that's saying a little bit too much about a printing press. The printing press doesn't have agency, but it does have particular properties. And some of those properties are particularly salient, and they enable developments to take place. To illustrate what I'm talking about, this is actually a photographer from The Hague, a Dutch city, and he happens to be a forebear of a good friend of mine. And in the 1930s, when he, or was it the 20s, I can't remember, when he first bought an automobile, as it was then called, a car, he drove it straight into a tree on his first trip. So he damaged the thing, and it was later explained that this was because he wasn't used to its speed. This was new technology, and the new technology did things that he didn't know it could do, and he was sort of driven by the car rather than him driving the car. This was where it happened. It's the road halfway between The Hague and Wassenaar, another place near The Hague. But my point is that the car is just as much a technology as the computer or the printing press, and that it came with unforeseen, unintended consequences. For example, it came with huge motorways, and it came with dormitory suburbs, places where people could live so that they could work somewhere else and drive to work every day. Now, I don't know what it's like here in Spain. It's probably not as bad as in Holland, but I think in Holland now between 2 and 3% of the country is covered in roads, believe it or not. Totally unforeseen consequences. This is not what the person who invented motor cars had in mind, of course. These are unintended consequences of the fact that the motor car appealed to us as a way to get from A to B. But it has become much more than a way to get from A to B. It has become a sign of status, a symbol of progress. It has become a way in which to express our individuality. It has become all sorts of things that nobody ever dreamt of. It has changed, I would suggest, our mentality about being human. Well, buy that or not, but you see what I mean. And I would say that this is also what is happening in the case of digital media. So just to go through what I meant earlier, if you take that salient property of immateriality, it's a salient property of the technology of digital text, then the actions or uses that it favors is access rather than ownership. because you don't want even to own bits and bytes, because they have no meaning, they have no substance. You cannot put them on the wall and say, well, here's my collection of books. So ownership's not relevant. So the social effects can be that the change in price perception goes down. Yeah? We don't really attach that much value to things that we cannot show, that we cannot touch, that have no substance. Similarly, two-way networking is a technological property, and I've said a few things about two-way networking, about the news, for example, but this is something else. As you all know, big companies like Amazon or Google or Apple or you name them sell content. They sell services around the content. Like iTunes is as much an infrastructure as it is the actual contents of that infrastructure. But they also make, and perhaps most money, off the largest thing that surrounds these two, and that is the details of their user behavior. That is where a lot of their capital resides. Amazon has been able to survive, though it wasn't making any money for a long, long time, on the fact that it was building up user profiles. So, we have all come to accept that this costs privacy. And people, when I talk to my students, they shrug their shoulders and say, privacy? Privacy? No longer important. In other words, the medium is the message, and to a much greater extent, I would say, than we like to admit, or even than we realize. I think it is very difficult to go against the message that the medium has. Now, this is an example of an attempt to go against it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Sieghart report. It came out in the UK last year. It's about e-book lending through the public library. And these were the recommendations from the Sieghart review. So, build in frictions that set 21st century versions of the limits to supply, which are naturally inherent in a physical book. So that translates as 1, lending of each digital copy to one reader at a time, even though, of course, as I said before, any file has an inbuilt printing press and it can create as many copies as you possibly like. Here, only one copy of a digital file. Secondly, digital books could be securely removed after lending. So, Big Brother is watching you. After your lending period has ceased, it will be wiped off your device. Digital books would deteriorate after a number of loans. And as you all know, this is what happened also in America. Publishers agreed on lending ebooks, but only 27 times. Because that was the number that physical books are lent before they have to be replaced. Now, you can say, all right, this is a transitional period, we have to adapt. True, but I would say this is a doomed attempt at recreating physical constraints in a digital world. And I would say that the reason why this is doomed is because of changing mentalities. People do not understand this. Maybe inside the publishing industry people do, but ordinary readers, my students, certainly don't accept this at all. They don't understand what this is all about. You can explain it to them, and rationally they will accept it, but it goes against the whole new mentality that they've developed. Like it or not, the web is changing the way we think. And of course that is the title of my book, Changing Our Textual Minds Towards a Digital Order of Knowledge. And I would suggest that there are a few lessons we have to take away from this whole story, and that is primarily that we have limited control over the technology, even though we are the inventors of that technology. Intuitively, that makes no sense. We invented the web. Why don't we have control over it? Well, we invented the motor car. We don't have any control over how many people die from road accidents. We don't have any control over how much pollution cars make. That just comes with the new technology. So I would suggest to you that that is exactly the same in the case of digital reading technology. And I like the comparison that Professor Floredy from the Oxford Internet Institute made. You can be ever so good a gardener, have really green fingers, but the seed will not turn into anything else than it is. You can't create raspberries out of a strawberry plant. They're different things, however good you are with your fingers. And that is what I meant by inherent technological properties. So, our lessons are, I think, that technology's salient properties have intended and unintended effects, and that we have to try and understand which are these salient properties. We have to understand what social effects they might have. And I think we have to understand that these effects might be greater than we care to admit. And just to end on two recent books that are suggesting the same sort of thing. This is one, oh sorry, that was a bit fast. The People's Platform, I don't know if you've heard of it yet, but it's a very interesting book. It talks about the concentration of economic power that happens through the web, that ideologies like openness and sharing are being appropriated by the commercial web, and talk about, then we're thinking of Amazons, Googles, and etc. of this world, and that the long tail, nice as it sounds, is much of a myth. That is to say that, for example, if scholars use databases for their references, that they will follow each other in quoting and citing, rather than finding their own sources of quotes. So you get a concentration rather than a broadening out. The long tail is not as good as we have always hoped it would be. And this then is a recent book that I very much recommend in your attention. And that is a book that talks about the role of IT as a driver of income inequality. And I think it's a fantastic essay on how digital technology enables developments that we have certainly not wanted, that are totally unintended, and they play into the hands of the very biggest multinationals, but leave us entirely powerless as human beings. Thank you very much.